communicate that without the slide.
Discussion. So what we're hoping to do here with these last 3 slides is sort of seed the discussion for this and subsequent meetings. And the slide deck will be available on our webpage for this effort, so you don't need to memorize them. But the idea being is that, especially when we come down to the drafting of the regulations, if there's strong opinions about methodology, what we're measuring, how we're doing compliance calculations, who should be subject to the MCL, and what kind of monitoring we want to see. We're looking for that kind of input specifically, both today and in subsequent meetings. We hope that the next meeting of this group will actually get into any ideas about those kind of numbers as well. Other questions?
I guess just a comment. I understand why, but I'm a little concerned about the waste site cleanup rules running ahead of this process. It seemed because the GW1s are going to equal or will equal the MCL, there's almost a predetermination going in. The idea of the groundwater levels then going back and changing somehow, that doesn't always work smoothly. So
yeah.
I suspect DEP has thought about that, but it is a little concerning. If these processes are going to ultimately wind up in the same place, why one would go ahead of the other?
Sure. So the question was, why is waste site cleanup ahead of us? And the number that they might propose and then finalize would potentially predict what the MCL would be. And my answer would be, our phrases we're using, they'll be aligned. And there could be an iterative process where they actually would change the alignment. I think it's safe to say that we have put out proposed MCLs before that we've then finalized as different numbers. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that we're totally locked in on the idea that they're necessarily the exact same number. Paul's got maybe some extensive.
Well, and I think the department is committing to, at least I'm committing, as the process works its way, if in fact the drinking water program moves to promulgate a different number, you refer to sometimes that doesn't happen. The easiest way to make that happen is to commit to joining that process.
Right.
And at the same time, concurrently, propose modifying the MCP standard to be the equivalent of the MCL. So I think that is our goal and our intention, that if there ends up being a difference, and there very well may be, because of the information is coming in quickly, it's changing, we want to keep up on it, we will commit at that point to make sure that the GW1 number goes out for public comment again with the MCL.
That's probably the best answer we can give you, is that is our commitment, and we'll hopefully be able to maintain that.
And I guess, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to make sort of one simple addition, just to make it clear that the same toxicological information, the science, the research that is underpinning what we're going to propose in the waste site cleanup regulations, that is the same information that we'll consult, that we'll look at, and that will inform the drinking water standard. The same information that our Health Effects Advisory Committee will be looking at in terms of thinking about the current drinking water advisory. So it's more that it's just consistent. Obviously, there are different media, there's sort of different criteria that one looks at, but it's all the same information that will be informing our process.
And one additional comment from the waste site cleanup side, there is a benefit to having those standards, and particularly the notification criteria out there, because we can't, in the waste site cleanup world, cannot wait. Our sites are being discovered, they are being assessed now. We are answering questions every day of, well, what do we have to do? What do we have to meet? And the numbers that will be going up there will be helpful to facilitate that process.
In terms of that MCL development process, I mean, EPA's is pretty rigorous in terms of the toxicological, epidemiological studies, the risk assessment, and then a key piece, cost benefit. And I mean, you just sort of gave a brief overview, but I'm sort of curious how those bigger EPA pieces fit into the state program, because they're quite important.
Yeah, so the question is, can you be a little more specific about the comparisons between the EPA MCL development process and what we will be doing and have done in the past? And I would start with the toxicology. I would say we're equivalent. The Office of Research and Standards publishes the full technical documents that they use to establish the ORSG. You know, there's a technical support document from last year when they published their ORSG, and there'll be another one if they revise it. The cost-benefit analysis, a little less comparable. What we're mostly required to do is ensure that if there is a cost to municipalities or small businesses, that we state that cost up front, you know, as well as we can understand it. And so what we tend to do is, as we craft a regulation of this nature, we talk about what's the typical laboratory cost for a sample, and what's the typical treatment cost for what we expect to be a best available technology. So that when the public is commenting in the regulatory process, they have a sense of, these are the likely costs. And so it's really more of a transparency rather than a, we've done an analysis and we think this is a worthwhile cost-benefit weighing.
Sorry.
Chris?
At the EPA, the unveiling in Chelmsford of the PFAS action plan,
Yeah.
We were able to ask Alexandra Dunn about the science that was used in Vermont versus the science that has been used with the EPA standards.
Mm-hmm.
And she was very upfront in telling us that they don't have the infant information in the EPA standards. So I'm wondering whether or not Massachusetts will be including the toxicology information for fetuses and infants, particularly those born and breastfeeding from people in decades-long exposed populations.
So the question is about the difference between EPA establishment, which they've acknowledged does not include the toxicological concerns for the infant studies. Vermont has identified that as something that has kept them at a lower number. As part of our petition response, we did acknowledge that we would review the Vermont information, so I know I'm not the Office of Research and Standards, so I'm not going to predict which specific studies that they're looking at, but I believe that is part of our full review.
And I think, and just to add to that, I think the plan for our next meeting, middle of June, is once the MCP regs are out for public comment, we'll be able to provide some more information on how we came up with those values and what's behind that.
And that is certainly the type of comment we were hoping to get as part of the MCP review as well.
Yeah.
So just on the, going back to the treatment standards.
Yep.
So when, not necessarily technology used, but the designs of the systems.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the concerns that we had in Westfield is that when we did our bench scale testing, we did this testing on wells that have been turned off for more than a year, and we did the testing on a well that was further from the contamination source
Right.
after a 4-hour runtime on 450,000 gallons, which is not indicative of full-time
Right.
use of the well. So we don't feel that the design necessarily will be effective for the contamination that we have there, that plume there under the most contaminated site.
So the statement comment is about designing a treatment process from a well that's really been offline for a significant amount of time, and whether or not the ramp up to test that idea of just an appropriate technology was an appropriate length of time and simulated normal activity for that well. All I can really respond to that is that the expectation based upon what we're seeing is that you continue to look at raw water quality, and if influent were to drastically change, we would potentially make a determination about whether or not that well would stay online. So you're usually looking at systems that are considered lead lag. So you get two types of systems, so that the treatment goes into the first canister and you test between them. So you're looking for what's called breakthrough. And so if there's a treatment failure, you get a notice of it before it actually breaks through into the public. And so the idea is that the close monitoring that we expect in a treatment system like that would hopefully give us an advanced notice that this isn't working. And you take it offline before, in fact.
Just to follow up on that, I mean, a lot of the issue too, it's not just the health aspects, it's the cost.
Yep.
And if we're gonna install systems that may not necessarily work, it doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense to do that in the first place.
Yeah, and so the question is, there's a cost risk here. You're putting money out there to construct something that you don't really know is going to be a permanent solution. And that's basically, that's true. There's really no way to predict necessarily how these systems in a new contaminant environment, we don't have any history to go look back on and say that, yeah, we know GAC can handle this influent. We're hoping to see those kind of studies before more and more systems get into it. Unfortunately, you're one of the first systems in the Commonwealth looking at that kind of a concern, so we don't have better data that we can really base a decision on.
Kind of on top of that, considering this, treatment techniques are still in flux.
Yep.
What's the confidence of having an educated and able engineers in the Commonwealth in order to design all these systems that we might all of a sudden need after this MCL is passed?
Yeah, so the question is,
And
how confident are we that we've got an engineering community that knows how to respond to these contamination events? Basically, we're hoping that they're looking at national levels. They're not looking at just what's happening in Massachusetts, that these are companies large enough to reach out to other companies and talk about experiences in New York, in Pennsylvania, and in the other states that have taken some treatment actions already.
If I could, we have a fair amount of engineering consultants in terms of our membership, and I think they are quite on top of
Okay.
the technology piece.
A number of us
Maybe the
attended
bigger
it.
firms. I work with mostly just all small systems,
Yeah.
and they hire, sometimes a mom and pop engineer.
Absolutely. So,
And I worry about because they're usually less expensive than the bigger
Sure.
firms.
So the question is, what about the mom and pop engineering shops? There are emerging, and I would say they're at a level now where it's probably effective even for those types of shops, technical resources that are available to anyone. The ITRC held a conference here 2 weeks ago, and they're basically providing these kind of, I'll call it support services to anyone who wants to look at these fact sheets. And so the idea being that you want to know what's appropriate for your situation. Maybe there's another situation you can go into these resources and find. So what you're hoping to do is to find an engineering group that's hopefully at least savvy enough to know where to look for these resources. But they can also come to us. We have engineers in the drinking water program that can say, hey, have you looked at the ITRC stuff? Have you looked at anything from American Water Works Association, from Mass Water Works Association? There's a community out there trying to solve this problem, and they're making a lot of their own resources available to anyone who wants to read about them.
What's ITRC?
Sorry. Paul, ITRC stands for?
Interstate Technology Research Regulatory Council.
Thank you. It's basically, I'll call it a collection of like the engineering and scientific community, and they have a broad range of focus, but they have a PFAS specific group.
I just want to go back to Kristen's point about the health studies.
Sure.
Is someone from the ORSG going to attend one of these meetings so we can talk about the studies that are being reviewed, provide information? I ask because I've spoken with the toxicologist and the folks that worked on NRDC's March 15th report that came out less than a month ago. It's already outdated because there's so many new studies and so much more work happening on the PFAS front. So I'm very concerned that something's going to be missed if we're not able to continuously provide new information to our ORSG and be sure that they're seeing all the most recent health studies that are just there's
Sure.
more every day.
It's every week, yeah. So the
Yeah.
question was, will ORS, the Office of Research and Standards, attend this stakeholder group? And I think the answer is yes.
Yeah, so that would be the intention for our next meeting, is to
Okay.
definitely have ORS here, and, we keep talking about the iterative process with the wayside cleanup rules,
Yeah.
and the ORSG revision, and then informing what the MCL is gonna be, so that will be a big part of the discussion next time, and also, as Paul keeps saying, those are specifically the kinds of comments that we'll be looking for, in the context of the MCP regulation.
Great.
Right,
But
because
yes,
the MCP
we
is
will
based
get-
upon the same studies, we're hoping that there's public engagement opportunities that can occur then and in our process. And some of that is to also take into account the fact that next week we might hear something else.
Yes, right.
So yeah, we are well aware that the toxicology is emerging. I mean, obviously EPA published their draft assessment for Gen X and PFBS just last fall. It's still a draft assessment, so that's subject to review and comment. So the underlying studies change on a fairly regular basis, and there are active academic groups working on these that will undoubtedly continue to publish as we continue to look at this.
I just make to say one other thing. We mentioned before that the ORS is reconvening the Health Effects Advisory Group, and it's partly for that very reason, to review the updated research, and that will be that they started to organize the meeting. I think we're looking at beginning or mid-May, and so that and our ORS has sort of recompiled, has been continually analyzing the new information, is bringing it to this group. If you are thinking of a particular study or source that you think we might not know about, please tell us. We don't have to wait for the next meeting to have that conversation. We can sort of feed that into their process. Great.
And our ORS this is the MassDEP toxicologists, are also participating in multi-state conversations with other toxicological groups. I know they're discussing, one group is like a New England, New York kind of based group, and then there's national groups as well that they continue to participate in. So the idea is that if any state picks up on something, they share it with the other states so that we're not repeating work and discovering things, you know, after the fact.
I think another important piece of this whole MCL development process is a communications piece, which we haven't talked about, and I think we need to spend some time doing so, and it may require expertise outside of this room, but I mean, we are very concerned about public confidence in drinking water, and we need to communicate this in a way that, you know, our public is sure that we're on top of it and that they're not, you know, they're not going to shy away from drinking water.
So the comment is, you know, obviously, and this is a standing concern for the department as well as the utilities, is that, you know, we have to be careful about the risk communication with any emerging contaminant. You know, the unknowns are much higher than the knowns at this point, and so we won't want to create something that shakes the confidence in the safety of public drinking water.
Along with that communications piece, I'm curious about what things you're doing around communicating existing sources of funding for municipalities.
Yeah, so the question is, what are existing sources of funding are out there, specifically to deal with PFAS? You know, essentially right now, the state revolving fund is probably the principal one that the state has some authority over and is able to extend to municipalities looking to deal with this. Obviously, under wayside cleanup type processes and under the Superfund processes under CERCLA, there are other cost recovery, I think is the right phrase, options when you go to a contaminant that's ended up being a PRP, a potentially responsible party. So the military in some cases, or the Fire Training Academy and others, when they're identified as part of a cleanup process, then there are cost sharing obligations, I don't know the right phrase there, but where they can seek funding from them.
And how accessible is that information all in one place so that if someone is curious about how to access that funding, they can see the list?
So the SRF is all in one place in MassDEP. There's two SRFs, the drinking water SRF and the clean water SRF, so wastewater or drinking water systems, and those are the target municipal services that they serve.
Right.
So that's all one spot. Cost recovery information on, you know, I think that's part of the cleanup process when they get involved.
Yeah, if there
Discussing
is
pays.
a responsible party and there's a source, then working with the wayside cleanup program, often rather than cost recovery, the kind of most efficient way of doing it would be to work with the responsible party so that they fund and do the treatment. And that's what's happening, for example, in Hudson.
Right. So as the source is identified and the PRP is identified, we simply make the PRP pay for the utilities treatment.
Right. Part of what I'm curious about is whether or not that could be all in one place, so that if someone from the community or if a municipal employee wants to start pursuing other sources of funding, that's really accessible all in one place, so they can see, is this applicable to SRLF? Is this applicable to CERCLA?
Okay. Yeah, so the comment is just it'd be good to have a one-stop shopping for municipal sources of funding or any other affected utility.
So just to follow up on that, I wonder if Wikia would apply, if municipalities be able to take out Wikia loans, and if so, can that be added into that one stop?
So Wikia is the additional congressionally funded infrastructure fund. I presume it probably is, but Wikia tends to be geared towards very large municipal projects, kind of things that the MWA might do. It's not
comes
usually
with a $100,000 application fee. So most municipality, you put that money in up front before they tell you whether you're going to get the money. Most small municipalities kind of shy away from putting $100,000 on the table on the chance that they might get a grant.
Yeah, so
we put
it's
$4 million
structured
on
for
the
that.
table with the chance that the technology is going to work, and we don't know.
It's mostly structured for that.
Up to $4 million.
Yeah, it's you know, the typical awards have been for $100 to $400 million projects. It's, you know, Miami or San Francisco, not necessarily a small community.
And I think,
Okay.
so sorry, I
That's
was
fine.
just going to say, I know too that the state revolving fund has been offering a better interest rate. In the end, it ends up being lower cost borrowing for most of the projects that have come forward that could potentially qualify for Wikia. And while I interrupted you,
No,
I'll just
please.
say on the one-stop shopping is always a great idea, but I just want to underscore, make sure it's clear that for all of the impacted communities, our various regions are working closely with them so that they know what is waste site cleanup doing in terms of site investigation. Here's where you can go to help fund your treatment, and really are talking to them, if not on a daily basis, very frequently, to make sure that they know what are all the resources that are available that can assist.
Yeah, I mean, the Wikia program really came out of the idea that, a large regional utility could totally take the entire SRF budget for a state for 1 year, easily in the kind of project they tend to try to fund. So it became this sort of parallel effort for really the largest utility projects. Yes?
So we talked about residuals, but we didn't talk about the filter media you're going to give utility members relief as managing and disposing and handling of the media.
Yeah, so what we know so far is that the GAC can be sent to the same kind of incinerators and regenerated. It could also be dealt with as a waste stream, and so then you got to figure out, is there some other place you could put it that's not going to create additional contamination? So
will the drinking water program be handling that, or will waste site be handling that?
it's not waste site cleanup. So we typically look for residual management plans in a treatment proposal. So depending on the technology that's selected by the public water system, we're looking to say, all right, so they're going to do a reverse osmosis type system. Let's say it's a smaller system. You've got a large reject water now that has got a high concentration of PFAS. What's your solution for that? Because if the publicly owned treatment works isn't accepting it, you can't put it in your septic system, have you got a hauler and a tight tank kind of situation. So we're looking for solutions that have to be comprehensive.
Yeah, I think we're getting down into the nitty-gritty, and I want to make sure that we can just take a step back and like just take a bigger step back. And then I do have a couple of
Yeah, no problem.
things
We're
too. So yeah, I just want to remember that we're here because tens of thousands of families across Massachusetts have been poisoned from the water coming out of their tap, and I think we need urgency, and we need strong enforceable standards that protect infants and children and our most vulnerable populations, and that having poisoned drinking water is a violation of their civil rights. And I hear this urgency from you around the MCPs, and I think we need the same level of urgency around the MCLs and some of the other things that we're talking about here. I hear for the MCLs that you're going to be coming out with this standard in spring of 2020, potentially.
Can't predict.
So what I'm hearing is that people aren't going to get tested or find out that their water has been contaminated for 2 or more years once those rules get put into place, once they get that testing, once they get the public notification, and once they actually can get access to clean and safe drinking water. And that seems unacceptable.
So I'll repeat it first. So the concern is the length of time we're talking about here to get an MCL out there and then kick off monitoring. That is true that there's a package of months or whatever that has to happen no matter what we do, no matter how fast this process works. We have some things that will take months, not weeks. That being said, I think you heard earlier that we're already following up on everyone we've identified with PFAS contamination. We have all the authority we need to do that. And I believe we said this in the response to our petition, that we have also actually decided to target certain public water systems for testing, either that were not part of UCMR3 testing, or that were but are close to other now known sources of PFAS. We hope to roll it out this calendar year. I can't put a date on that at the moment, but it's probably, I would say, close to imminent.
That's weeks, not months.
Yeah,
right?
that's probably weeks away, and so then what we think we're trying to do here is to deal with the potential but unknown contamination sites across the Commonwealth already. With testing, we have the capability to test for these compounds at the state laboratory in Lawrence. EPA has also offered their assistance on analytical work, so we don't think we've got a problem in getting samples done. It's what we did in Harvard just recently and what we've done in Hudson, where we've taken now newly identified sites and done work ourselves to help move the process along. Even without a numeric standard, we heard a little bit of a difference in how one bureau and another bureau can deal with the lack of a standard. We don't need an MCL to take action at a public water system. All we need is an assessment by the Office of Research and Standards to say this level of this contaminant is unacceptable.
Do you know that
I'm sorry,
targeted
I'm not
sample?
done. Yeah, I have a couple of more pieces.
Oh yeah,
there.
sorry, I'll come back to Steve.
Is so Also for sludge,
Yep.
I think we know that, sludge is highly contaminated, and in the same urgency around the MCPs, I think we need to stop PFAS contaminated sludge applications before we get, a treatment standard or any standard around sludge and PFAS. And then similarly with incineration, I think the idea that we can incinerate these chemicals away is, they're firefighting foams. I think we have very little science that's fact about how incineration is going to get rid of these PFAS chemicals. And we're working in Vermont with a Save Our County, a community group in East Liverpool, Ohio, where Vermont was going to send the firefighting foam incineration to, and they were an incinerator that has never been, all of the 12 all the testing that's available online have never abided by their permit requirements, and Vermont was going to send our firefighting foam there to be incinerated. And so we know that was poisoning that community through the incineration of these chemicals. They weren't getting the incinerator hot enough. So I just want to, incineration is not a solution to get rid of our PFAS problem. And so that's kind of my things around urgency, and then just a couple quick process things too. I think for the MCP process of having a hearing on Martha's Vineyard in particular, because it is, we already know it's an impacted community, and it's pretty far away and hard to get to. And so that would be, I think, a good place to start. I think also, wanting to make sure that we can consider all chemicals that we know of in the Massachusetts drinking water. I think we need a class-based approach for sure for addressing PFAS, but not considering PFBS in the MCL when we know that it's in Westfield's water seems also pretty unacceptable. And then similarly, I think, we also definitely want to encourage doing the top assay and the specific PFAS chemical testing as part of the MCL process. And then you mentioned the UCMR again too. I think 2013 was a pretty long time ago, and we have much better testing techniques, and I think we do need to retest all of those sites. And really nitty gritty, I think looking at the chart that you put forward, Michigan came out with their health standards on April 4th that were between 8 and 84 parts per trillion for 4 PFASs. And so I think that needs to be included as a comparison. That your chart, I think, said it was on 4.9, and so it should include those new Michigan numbers.
So let me start from the
Sorry,
end.
Thank you.
The chart comes from our toxicologists. Yeah. So whether or not we're including Michigan, the chart comes from our toxicologists. So this is everything they're following and more. So yes, that's part of our analysis. As far as concerns on urgency and incineration, I think I have to refer to Paul in terms of are we being selective in the choice of an incinerator and their ability to destroy these compounds?
Yes, and we can get more information, but we have specifically looked and checked and followed our contractors who are carrying out the process. And like I said before, I don't remember the specific facilities that took the material, but we have looked and checked to make sure that they are operating at the high temperatures that they're in compliance with their permits.
I know that question came up before, and I know that I heard that kind of answer and more extensive from the program that did that. So I'm hoping that we can reassure the public that, in fact, we are selecting an incinerator capable of doing a destruction of these compounds.
Yeah, I think we don't know that these incinerators can destroy these compounds. They can break them down into smaller PFAS molecules.
I think we know as well as we can. Let's put it that way.
All right.
As far as residuals go, I think you heard Doug talk about that there isn't an approved method. There isn't even an agreed upon methodology to develop that method right now, and there's no standards for what you do when you find it in a residual. So the question is, do we have any knowledge of a contaminated residual? And that's what we're trying to answer first. Do we have residuals that we know are being land applied where we can detect PFAS in? When we can answer that question, then we can answer the question of should we just stop it now, or should we help develop a standard, a leaching standard, if you will, that would ensure that you're not getting stuff off that residual. And I think I answered the MCL. We don't need the number yet to do the work on the monitoring. Did I miss anything? Sorry, I'm trying to keep track.
Martha's Vineyard.
Martha's Vineyard. So where we hold our hearings. Paul, where are you guys holding the Southeast hearing? Lakeville.
So the Southeast hearing is in Lakeville. So those 4 hearings are kind of set in concrete at the moment.
Yeah.
What the Secretary of State will publish. We will investigate, whether it's a formal public hearing, or a meeting to collect comments, put it to the record. Then we have had public meetings on Martha's Vineyard as part of that site investigation. It would not be difficult to either piggyback on one of those meetings or hold a separate meeting for it.
So I think you're hearing that we're committed to try to reach out to the affected communities as much as we can. And certainly the islands are a more difficult place to get to, but
I think a happy medium might be Hyannis.
Absolutely.
Because Lakeville is not really even convenient for people on Cape Cod, right?
Yep.
So Hyannis could.
Yeah, and we actually used to have a DEP drinking water office in Hyannis. They loaned us some space for a while, several years back. So we definitely understand the challenge of crossing the Bourne Bridge. I look at Steve. Did you still have?
It was a really simple question. You talked about this targeted sampling. Which
right.
How many sites and how chosen?
Sure. So the question is, what's the details of our targeted public water system sampling? Right now, what we're doing is by identifying either a point source, like another public water system is contaminated, or an area like the Devons, area where the base is the contamination. We're doing within 2 miles another public water system that's in that 2-mile buffer of those kind of sites. And essentially that's where we're going to go out. I think it's about 35 sources at the moment, but we're reevaluating the UCMR3 participants because, as we heard earlier, they measured at a much less sensitive level. And so we're also looking for any UCMR3 participant that had non-detect at those higher measurement levels and are within 2 miles of a known PFAS source. So we're going to probably put them in the mix as well.
Shifting back to where you hold these public hearings,
Sure.
just so that we can all understand, what actually are the limitations in terms of holding either additional hearings or changing the existing hearings that are set in concrete?
Okay, so the question is, what are the limits on public hearings, and how can we change any ones that have been published? No limits, and not easily. We can add more than likely change. So although we might hold a Lakeville meeting, and I think they're now committed to do it, and publishing that in the Mass Register, it doesn't prohibit them from holding a Hyannis meeting. So if the department feels there are communities and areas that are not being able to get to one of our public hearings, and we hear that comment, then we could hold another meeting or something similar in another area. So there are no, Secretary of State doesn't say you have to have X number of public hearings and they have to be within whatever distance. It's totally up to the department to decide where we want to go and what we want to hear from.
So you just need to hear that comment.
Yeah, we just need to hear it. Absolutely. Yeah, if we feel that, if we only held a, sorry?
And we just heard it.
Yeah, I know, but specific examples would be great. Like if you say Hyannis, we've heard that, and that's hopefully now recorded.
Westfield.
Yeah, Westfield. So the idea that we understand it's difficult people to travel to hearings, and so we couldn't just hold a Boston-based hearing and expect anyone from Western Mass to attend. So we do try to get out to as much of the corners of the state as we can reach, in a reasonable balance of effort and such. Yes.
Will DEP consider strategies such as the New Jersey Department of the Environment to order chemical companies to pay the cost of dealing with PFAS contamination?
So the question is, will we consider similar strategies like what New Jersey just published, which is to mandate cost recovery, I'll call it, from the chemical companies?
I will defer that question partly because it's something that it's not necessarily DEP itself, it's the Attorney General's office that makes a lot of those decisions. I can speak.
Yep.
I swear to God, it's just 2 right now. I'm wondering whether or not you could speak to the upcoming terrain with respect to air emissions and wastewater emissions. If so many Massachusetts residents are drinking surface water, how do air deposits from manufacturers come into account with this process? And what about the wastewater?
Doug?
Yeah, so I don't think at this point there is air monitoring requirements for permitted facilities that have air emissions under our air rules. I don't know if anybody has any
For PFAS specifically.
for PFAS specifically. So I think unfortunately we're in a situation now where we're driven more by, do we see contamination, and then looking at the cause of the contamination, and does it end up being like what they saw in Vermont or New Hampshire,
Right.
where it proved to be air deposition. So, unfortunately, at the tail end, the impact end, and then working our way backwards. And for wastewater emissions, that's something that we're beginning to think about, and I'm unaware of any state in the nation that has developed either a standard, a surface water quality standard, or a monitoring requirement for wastewater emission, wastewater discharges. That includes federal and state, but it's something that the states are thinking about and starting to look into, and I would think we'd have some more information on it as this process goes on.
Thank you.
I have a question and comment on,
Sure.
you touched upon a little bit of private wells, not the focus here, but public water systems are, but, an MCL for a public water system will now become basically the standard for a private well.
Yeah.
You mentioned that you already did some private well work with people that had contamination. What was done, working with the boards of health and,
Sure, let me, so repeat the question, I'll toss it to Paul. The question is, private wells basically aren't under our regulatory authority, but in fact, we do a lot of assistance. In addition to writing draft regulations that local boards of health could adopt, we also do recommend that they review our standards whenever we come out. We go out every year to the Mass Health Officers Association and talk about emerging issues. So we just finished a loop through those meetings this spring talking about PFAS. So we try to make sure that they're educated about the risks, and that essentially a private well at someone's residence is the same exposure risk as a community public water system because they're serving homes. So we say this is an equivalent number that you should be concerned about in a private well. As far as the work we've done with private wells, it's under the waste site cleanup activities, so I'll ask Paul.
Okay, so under waste site cleanup, as David said, we look at that as an ongoing, continuing exposure. So we look at it a couple of different ways. One is we work with the community, including the local boards of health, who are CC'd on kind of all of the communications, and where we're working with or at private water supplies, it will be a much closer interaction with them. So we'll work to make sure that the exposures of concern are addressed, mitigated, and for instance, in Westfield, there are a number of we've sampled almost 100 private wells in the area around the contaminated public water supply well, and have put in place at least a handful of point of entry treatment systems to make sure that the residents are being protected. That said, ideally we would have a potentially responsible party do that work. And in Hudson, that's what's happening with our oversight. The responsible party is doing that similar, not only working with the public water supply and the contaminated public well, but they are sampling private wells in the area and doing point of entry treatment systems as we require. Where we have to do it, we will look to recover our costs to the extent that we can.
And similar work has occurred in Bourne, similar work has occurred in Air, because these are areas that have kind of mixes of public water extent and private well as well. So you look at any affected resource when they start doing the kind of work that the waste site cleanup does.
now is it that to install the point is that is it maintained? Is there a certain cutoff that DEP says that the homeowner's on your own? You put it in there, you have to replace the filters every so often.
It may vary. The question is there maintenance included in that, and that will depend on a variety of different factors, but we try to kind of work that out with the homeowners and with where the responsible party is paying for it, with them as well.
And historically, you'll also see activities such like, especially in areas where you've got a public water system nearby, the PRP may choose to pay for the extension of the public water to those neighborhoods that are on private wells. I think that's occurred in Charlton, that comes to mind, where they, if it's feasible, I mean, you can't go miles with a water main, but you could go a couple hundred yards, feet, whatever you can do to pick up a new neighborhood that was all private wells.
Down on the Cape, the Air Force is in fact hooking some small public water supplies, I forget the transit lines.
Yeah.
But the small public water supplies up to the large community public water supplies.
Actually, I think it's also the solution in Litchfield, New Hampshire, that did that. That's where the air deposition was affecting Merrimack, New Hampshire residents, and Litchfield, if I remember the geography right, is just south of the affected neighborhood, and they extended the public water system into that neighborhood to deal with those contaminated private wells. So it kind of is a little site-specific, but these are the flavor you'll see on the menu.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. If somebody, because I know some people in the Hyannis, Barnstable area where I come from, that have private wells, and their drinking water that they find out has PFAS in it, and what filters at that level could they buy that would be effective? I mean, if you go on the web, there's a million filters in like...
it's always difficult for us to make a specific commercial purchase requirement.
Yeah, any type.
We're starting to look into that so we can at least understand the technologies we recommend. As it happens, the National Sanitation Foundation has now created a PFAS standard. It's only based on the EPA Lifetime Health Advisory, though, so when these devices are certified to that standard, they're only certifying for PFOA and PFAS at 70 ppt. But it's a start. And that's the kind of thing we probably steer people to, is more of a performance and certification standard rather than a particular product.
brand.
Yeah, so NSF P473, I think, is what just came out, if I get the number close. And you can go to the NSF website and, in fact, just search. Show me all the manufacturers that have this certification. I did it yesterday, and there's something like anywhere from, I'm thinking around 30 to 50. And some of them are just screw onto your kitchen counter, some of them are under the counter reverse osmosis units, some of them are whole house point of entry devices. So the industry is responding to the need that you're talking about, and I think you're going to see that continue to expand, especially as more entities like us start looking at lower standards than the EPA health advisory.
And I think it would also be helpful, to the extent that we can put links to those sites that...
We did.
Yes, okay, great.
Okay.
We put a link to the NSF. NSF put out a press conference on that, or a press release on that, and it's linked on our PFAS site for MassDEP.
I just had a question for Paul. So you had said that you connected certain small public water systems. I'm wondering how small to other water systems, and because one of the issues we had in connecting is we'd actually have to create a surface filter treatment plant because we have groundwater currently.
It's a condo in Mashpee, and it got hooked to the municipal-sized system. The municipal system doesn't cover 100% of the town.
Right.
So they picked up a small condo. That was previously a community public water system, but that just means it serves 25 residents who live in the condo. So that's the example in Mashpee.
And that was done by the Air Force
as
part of the work at Joint Base Cape Cod.
And we had another mobile home park in the area that similarly was contaminated, and the military paid for them to connect to Bourne, I think. Yes?
All right, claim my tag here.
Sure.
Yeah, first of all, just the ITLA and the commercial laboratory community in general very much welcomes establishing an MCL and a regulatory structure around this. Just so you know, the instrumentation required to test for these compounds is extremely expensive, several $100,000. And commercial laboratories are reluctant to make that sort of expense unless they know that there is work out there. We have had experience anticipating a need for testing at some of our laboratories and made this expensive. It's just never materialized. So commercial laboratories tend to be somewhat conservative. Having requirements, having specific numbers to shoot for is something that laboratories can work around. If we know that the demand, the need is there, we'll gear up and do it. Our company, which is urethanes, is the largest commercial
laboratory network in the country really has somewhat, I'd say, limited capacity right now. We have 3 laboratories now who are running this testing. It's actions like these that are going to inspire other laboratories to bring on this capacity. Because right now, anyone who's actually tried to use a commercial laboratory to send this samples for this testing will know it's one of the most expensive analyses that we offer. The turnaround time tends to be somewhat lengthy just because there's so many samples right now. Just quickly regarding
Can you
the
just say
specific.
sorry to interrupt you. Could you just be specific about that cost? Like, what's sort of an average range?
I believe, and I'd have to get back this up, but it's somewhere around $150,000
Per.
We also
That's
per
the
instrument. For the instrument.
For the instrument.
The other
That application fee.
The analysis.
We bought one for the state. We don't have insert cost.
The analysis cost, it's somewhere around $250 per sample, plus or minus or something. So that's what we're looking at. The operators of these instruments, the interpreters of the data tend to be fairly seasoned chemists. So this isn't just a small meter you can stick in a sample and record the number. There's a lot of expenses. The other thing I wanted to mention is, our method detection limits tend to be around half of part per trillion, 1 ppt, which is low. Our reporting limits are approximately 2 parts per trillion. I suppose our concern would be that an MCL might be based on a toxicological type approach, where it's so low that we're looking at concentrations just right around our method detection limit. The concern there is that the method detection limit is essentially a signal to noise ratio, and the capacity for a false positive would be fairly high if it's set very low. So we're very curious to see what those numbers will be. Also, as you all know, PFAS compounds are ubiquitous. They're used in textiles, paper, packaging products, etc. So at a certain low enough level, you're going to find them everywhere, and the source of that contamination may not be the water that's being tested or the soil that's being tested. It could be on the sampler's clothing, for example. So just a lot of caveats that are involved here.
Yeah, so I think just to highlight some of those, we are looking for also input from a wide range of people concerned, because we need to have this analytical feasibility as part of our drafting our regulations.
Can I just have to
yeah,
say
please, go ahead.
I'm sharing what Heather said because we all need a laugh. But Heather just turned to me and said, so CLF's contribution here is we should advocate for testing naked.
Yeah.
No testing.
The ITRC meeting talked about safety naked, and I see a theme. But,
No video recording, just
right.
in a private room.
The analytical concerns are not to be really set aside as irrelevant. I mean, the state laboratory set up our instrument. It was in the $100,000 to $200,000 range to purchase, and then you have to convert it for this type of testing because a lot of the internal components are Teflon, and so you need to substitute those out. The manufacturers have come up with these substitution kits, but then once you've substituted out all the Teflon components, then you have to test your ability to run this method and to get it sensitive enough to get down to the kind of levels we're talking about here. And when we're talking about any kind of regulatory number that's an aggregate of multiple contaminants, each of those is at the kind of levels that Paul was talking about. If you can get down to C3 ppt, but you've got 5 contaminants in it, well, that means you're seeing 15 ppt. So you're really looking at an idea of, is it feasible to set an MCL where you really can't support it with testing? And so that's why we're hoping that things continue to evolve in our ability to measure without the signal to noise challenges.
Does any lab in Massachusetts do the top assay?
So not that we're aware of, we've been asking. Sorry, go ahead.
Laboratory
You know it.
in West Sacramento, California.
Yeah.
Does the test.
I was going to say, they do it in California. That's where I found it. We have a laboratory advisory group that also meets with MassDEP's state laboratory on a regular basis, and that's something that we connect through with the Independent Testing Laboratory Association. There's a New Hampshire-based association as well, and we can reach out to that kind of an industry through that group to say, what kind of capacity do we have? So although the question of can we have a top requirement as well, if we don't have labs to do it, then we can't have it. So it's always a, what can we do with the industry that's out there to measure?
Paul, you may not know, sorry, why don't you go ahead first? Just the sensitivity on the top assay, because I've heard it's not not this sensitive, this information I've had. I'm not sure. Okay.
We can take a note on that. I mean, we can ask and go through the labs that we know run it to get a sense of what they can do.
Can that, it's a Massachusetts Laboratory Advisory Group?
Yes.
Are they present at this meeting, or can they be present at the
So
next
I'm on
meeting?
it. We have one other member here who's on it as well, representing the Mass Water Works Association, but the laboratory people are also going to be part of this process as well as we get the certification regulations going as well.
ITLA is on it as well.
Yes, ITLA is on it as well. They sent a different member to this group, but yeah, they do represent. And yes, the MWA has a laboratory that does a lot of work, so they're on it.
And that's MassDEP's
It's MassDEP's
entity to convene. We convene it.
Yeah, we
Sorry,
convene
sorry.
it as necessary, so we bring agenda items. EPA is on it. Just trying to think of the other labs. There's a couple commercial labs that are in the New England area that come and tell us what's possible and what's out there, what concerns they might have as well.
So just pause for a second. So we're a little after 12:30.